What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 122. I'm the co-host Kyle Lanslone, joined by the co-host Will Porter. Will, how you doing today, buddy?
I'm doing great, Kyle. How you doing?
Doing well, and I think we'll have a show with some fireworks today. I think people are going to listen and maybe learn some things. We got some news on this one, but we got an important take on an issue where there is a lot of outrage, but it's for all the wrong reasons. So me and Will are going to have some fun with this one. I think y'all enjoy this show. Make sure you share it. YouTube and Odyssey for video versions. The show is hosted at the Libertarian Institute. For a full archive of the show, libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle. You could donate to the show on Patreon or Subscribestar, and follow the show at any of our social media sites, Facebook, MeWe, or Twitter. The Twitter handle is at @con/underscore interest. You could also support the show and get yourself some great CBD products by doing your shopping for CBD at Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com is the URL, and when you check out, you use the promo code PEACE, and that'll get you a 25% discount when you spend $75 or more. Will, I'm a big fan of their topicals, especially their sports cream. I gotta tell you, the bottle I have is going a long way. I've been using it 2 to 3 times a week. It works quickly, it smells good, and it doesn't feel like I'm on the end of the bottle yet. I think I've had it for well over a month, and so it seems like a pretty good value. I'm getting a lot of bang for my buck out of it. Well, what do you enjoy from Paloma Verde?
Yeah, my favorite, I think, are the melatonin soft gels. And actually, Carlos just told me he's going to send me they have a new formulation of their melatonin soft gels coming out. So I cannot wait to try those, because those are great for when you want to just wind down and relax at night, or if you have trouble sleeping, like as I do. That's definitely been my favorite. But they also have, like high dose tinctures, oil tinctures that are really great if you just want the pure CBD. So yeah, definitely check that out and use the promo code PEACE.
Yep. And that, again, the URL, PalomaVerdeCBD.com. All right, well, let's get into it. And the first show we have today is talking about this now very, very talked about tweet by Ilhan Omar, where Will Porter, she is accused by the Republicans and members of the Democratic Party of essentially being a terrorist and sympathizing with terrorists and calling Israel and the U.S. terrorist states. So let's, I guess, first break down what Ilhan Omar said, and then maybe we could get into the reaction, because there's like a missed reaction, or they think she said something she didn't, and then we'll get into what we think on the issue.
Sure. Yeah, so if people are watching the video version, they can see her tweet up on the screen. And it sort of summarizes her actual full comments, because she was asking the Secretary of State during a House committee hearing. She's asking Tony Blinken a question about the International Criminal Court. And sort of because the longstanding U.S. position is that the ICC has no jurisdiction over, U.S. forces or U.S. personnel. And so Omar was asking, like, if that's the case, well, then where should people look to for justice, say like in Afghanistan or something? Or she used the Palestinians as well, because the Israelis have a similar stance toward the ICC. However, in posing that question, she named the U.S. and Hamas and Israel and the Taliban sort of all on this one list of people or groups who, might commit atrocities. She was using these as examples. And so that is really, in her tweet, that also contains that list of groups and people. And so as you can imagine, she was immediately accused of comparing the U.S. and Israel to terrorist groups by Republicans as well as by fellow Democrats. And the Democrats may have even been more sort of feisty about this. I know Nancy Pelosi put out a statement saying that, she drew a false equivalency. Another group of Democrats said that she gave cover to terrorist groups, literally accused her of siding with terrorists. And I really think these statements, too, just show how close the two parties are on this kind of stuff. They sound very similar. It's kind of like if you were to read the two statements out loud, I wouldn't know which party had issued them. And unfortunately, Omar kind of gave into this. She, made a public clarification saying that, I was in no way, equating terrorist organizations with democratic countries that have well-established judicial systems. And she said she was making no moral comparison between them, which I guess is kind of what you can expect from a Democrat. Even in the supposedly progressive squad, they still do give into this kind of thing when, the head of the party, the Speaker of the House, comes out and attacks you for it. But I don't know. I mean, when we're talking about the Israelis, they do consistently inflict 10 times the civilian death toll compared to groups like Hamas. So like maybe in a sense there is sort of a false comparison here, but like kind of the other way around, like yes, Hamas, you can call them they're a scary religious group, but in terms of the actual like, people they kill, like the Israelis seem to have much higher death tolls always. And actually, it was funny. Hamas did weigh in and basically say exactly that. They were like, hey, don't compare us to the U.S. or the Israeli governments and their atrocities and aggression abroad. So it's kind of funny that they kind of turned that around. But I don't know. What did you think about this? What, like both Omar's original comments and the crazy reaction to them?
Yeah, so I think the one thing that people really missed in all of this is why Omar made the comments she did. And I think
Right.
it's because the ICC has jurisdiction when there's not another method within the nation that is going to get justice. And so let's say in Israel, they regularly investigated airstrikes, and then the commander that approved the airstrikes or the pilot that carried out the strike were to go to jail, then the ICC wouldn't have jurisdiction. The ICC is supposed to like be a replacement justice system. And I'm not saying this as like an endorsement for the ICC. I'm just explaining how it works. And so I think that's where Omar's questions are coming from. Is she's basically saying these are all examples of groups that don't face punishment when they carry out war crimes, which I mean is true. And I suppose since we've been commenting on things like say 2017 or so, the number of terrorist attacks from Hamas, I'm not sure of. I know the Taliban have carried out a couple and some like pretty nasty atrocities, but at the same time, it's not at the rate it was like a decade or two ago when these groups were carrying out more terrorist attacks. And so, over time, groups change. You have groups like the FARC in Colombia and the IRA in Ireland, which, have become over time more political, less militant, and, once carried out terrorist acts and now don't. And so, it's a very blurred situation as to, if you would presently call Hamas like a terrorist organization or, the Taliban a terrorist organization versus how much there's an insurgency and how much they're the armed resistance to an occupation, because occupied people do have a right to resist through violence if they have to, right? You can't say the Palestinians, all they could do in Gaza is walk to the border fence with their hands in the air, and the Israelis decide to just mow them down with sniper fire like they did in the spring of 2018. Well, when we were covering that on the whole show Foreign Policy Focus, that's not something you had that the Palestinians have to do. They have a right to fight back. Now, I think me and you both agree that there are things that are a step too far, and certainly the direct targeting of civilians, which is something that Hamas has done in the past, is a step too far. However, if we're just looking at the number of quantities of the times that Israel or the U.S. has targeted directly civilian targets and not held anyone accountable, I think that the number is far higher. And just look at the recent conflict between Gaza and Israel to see the example. Hamas fired indiscriminate rockets. They killed civilians. They killed children. But guess what? Israel killed a hell of a lot more of them. For all the times that you could point to in Afghanistan where the Taliban carried out a terrorist attack, you could find attacks carried out either by the Afghan Air Force, which is, just the U.S. proxy force in Afghanistan, or our own CIA, where, they blew up 30 pine nut farmers one day. They destroyed the Kunduz hospital, of Doctors Without Borders hospital. As the doctors were fleeing, they strafed them and killed them, and patients as well. Kids died in that. Nobody's held accountable. I could go on and on. Will, I don't know if you caught the recent revelations from Australia, where they're actually holding some of their special forces accountable. And you see one case where the guy just straight up walks up and kills an Afghan. Like, no more thought than a little boy would give, stepping on some ants or a spider or something. This guy just walks up and puts a bullet in some innocent man. And so, these atrocities were committed by the U.S. and our allies all the time. So the main problem I have with what Ilhan Omar says, she just wasn't firm enough. She needs to say that my own government government, and the governments that we are funding, just like Martin Luther King Jr. said, are the greatest purveyor of violence on the world today, and that includes attacks against civilians. I mean, again, you could look at Israel with like the Quantum massacre, as well as recently they hit Doctors Without Border hospitals. They're bombing civilian targets in Gaza. The pilots, reported that they were bombing them out of frustration. We talked about the March of Return. They killed March journalists. They killed a female doctor who had her hands up, her bat turned, and was in a medical vest. They killed her during those protests, a sniper round. So, this is, it's a brutal situation on both sides, but the side the U.S. bats is far more powerful, and that means they kill far more civilians and commit far more atrocities. And that's what Ilhan Omar has said. And, she should point out that what the U.S. needs to be far more concerned about than, we have to back Israel to make sure, we're holding Hamas accountable. But first of all, stop arming nations that are killing, tons of kids like Israel and Saudi Arabia. I don't know what's a worse atrocity. It's almost cartoonish to blow up a school bus full of children. This is like the kind of stuff they put on the, primetime TV hours. Like a man takes a school bus of kids hostages and threatens to kill them all. And thank God for the FBI profilers and the Stingray devices and everything else to help trap that guy down. They blew up a school bus full of 44 children, right? And Ilhan Omar is the problem, because she points out that the U.S. commits, horrendous acts, and she didn't even call them terrorist acts, which she absolutely should have. So, poo-poo on her for all that. The other thing that I thought was pretty disappointing from her, Will, is she focused a lot of her response on the whole, the attacks are Islamophobic and the attacks are, I guess a little bit of fairness for her, because of the way she looks, in the United States. If you're, a black-looking woman with a headdress on, that, and you make these kind of comments, like, it's probably going to draw maybe a little bit more fire. But at the same time, anybody who makes these comments is going to draw fire. And it's because of, the military-industrial complex, the indoctrination, and everything else. She's not really looking to battle power. She's just looking to demean the Republicans, even though her own party is going just as hard as her against as the Republicans. So I wish, she had really said what she should have said, but unfortunately, I guess at least the interpretation of what she said put our narrative somewhat in the mainstream, Will.
Right. Yeah, I tend to agree with your criticisms of her of just sort of not going far enough. I do think, though, it's good at least she's sort of pointing this out, because I do think the U.S. position that, like, we always can investigate our own war crimes, that, I don't know, that might be kind of inadequate. We wouldn't accept it if Russia claimed that, and maybe rightfully so. Not that I'm saying we should go around trying to boss them around and say that we're going to investigate them or something, but I don't know, maybe it is good to have an international mechanism that can come in and look at it neutrally or something. And so, I tend to agree with her there.
Right, you're right. I mean, me and you, I don't think oppose the OPCW or the IAEA as much as some, as long as they're doing non-biased investigations. I mean, that work can be valuable. And certainly, there are ways to have private funding for these kind of groups. I mean, you think Bellingcat would be the one the mainstream would point to, but I think we would point to veteran intelligence professionals for Sandy, the Ray McGovern-led group, where they are able to do analysis and hold independent investigations and look into these matters, and probably do a better job than the government. And so it doesn't necessarily need to be a government-run thing, although I guess, to put somebody in prison, you likely need a government. But at the very least, the findings of the war crimes reports can be important to highlighting that, there are some terrible people and we're going to identify and call them out, and, you shouldn't let these people around you. So, Will, anything else on this subject here with Ilhan Omar?
No, I mean, I think we hit on all the main points. The reaction was obviously overblown and just crazy. It was wrong for all I don't know. The reaction was for all the wrong reasons. And I think it did sort of demonstrate too, just to hear the shrieking from both sides, from hawks in the Democratic and Republican parties. It does kind of illustrate just how close they are on issues like this.
Right. And how uneducated their debates are. They have this thing that's a huge debate and
Right.
everybody's getting it wrong and misinterpreting each other. Well, the
Exactly.
other thing I want to note on the general subject here, Israel, Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel for the 12 years running, was ousted. And there's a new government that is a coalition that I don't think is going to last very long.
Yeah.
But but at the same time, Netanyahu at this time isn't the prime minister. Naftali Bennett is, and assuming the coalition holds together for a little over 2 years, Lavar Lapid will take over. Now, there's been a lot of talk about what this government is because it did have the support of at least a few members of the Israeli Arab parties. Those are, the Palestinians that live within Israeli borders and have the right to vote. Some of those represent members of the Knesset did vote
Yeah.
for this government. I don't think they have a position in the government. I think they got some like verbal kind of handshake promises, and there's a lot of skepticism I feel from the Palestinian community that this was a deal they should have entered into. But at the same time, I think it just goes to show that after 12 years, Netanyahu burned too many bridges. He had upset too many people. The current prime minister Bennett was once his protege, and I
That's right.
believe was the settler. Had something to do with like the settler in the West Bank. What was his position in the government, and so it's
Right.
cray that the Palestinian or the Arab parties are entering into a coalition with him. But I think it just goes to show how much Netanyahu was hated. Now, I think some people kind of are saying that this is the final nail in the Netanyahu coffin. And I certainly think that this, could be a very significant part of his overall downfall. But from my understanding, I think he's still a member of the Knesset. And his corruption trial hasn't happened yet. And if
Right.
this government falls apart before he's in jail for corruption, then or he somehow beats the charges, who knows what happens. It's not like he's out of politics and completely out of the game in Israel, although right now he's not one of the most powerful people in Israel as he's been the past 12 years. I will do just the last note I have was the vote was 60-59. So
Right.
it was by the thinnest of possible margins that Netanyahu was removed from power after 12 years. I think he spent 15 years total in power. He was prime minister for 3 years. There was a break, and then he came back. So
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting what's happening over there. This is like a, pretty big event. Like it seemed like kind of long in the making. Netanyahu struggled like for like 3 elections in a row to put together coalitions. Seemed like his support was kind of slipping, but now it is a weird coalition that's running. It's Yair Lapid, who I think is kind of, I mean, I guess you'd call him like center left, although what that means in Israeli politics is, everything's kind of shifted to the right. You have Naftali Bennett, who is very much a right winger, and then they've convinced like you said, the Arab parties, Ram, like the conservative religious Arab party, to somehow sign on to this. So I don't know how fragile or solid that is. That very well could collapse at some point.
right, absolutely. Now, Will, I want to move on and talk about Iran, which, in all honesty, when we're going to talk about the negotiations, like Israel almost always factors in.
Right.
Even recently when Netanyahu was swearing in the new Mossad chief like 2 weeks ago, they were threatening to continue to carry out activity within Israel or within Iran, the same
Yeah.
kind of, assassinations against nuclear scientists, attacks on the Natanz facility. But, to start out with here, we have some interesting statements from the U.S. about a boat that might cross the Atlantic Ocean. And
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Will, explain to me how this is somehow a threat to me or you.
Yeah, that is their position. And you and Pat, the great Pat McFarland, actually did mention these Iranian ships on the show last week. But at the time, I think it was still sitting somewhere off the African coast. But some more has happened since then. So there's actually two Iranian. They are warships. It is a destroyer and like an intelligence support vessel, the Sahand and the Makran, and they have now made it into the Atlantic Ocean, which is actually a first for the Iranian Navy. They've never successfully crossed the Atlantic with a naval vessel. But apparently now they are further than they've ever been in that goal. And it's not really clear where these ships are headed. U.S. officials have been claiming over and over again that they're going to Venezuela, possibly to complete a weapons deal, a weapons sale that was signed last year. But I've seen nothing that really confirms that. It's sort of just like what they're insinuating. And Politico had some good reporting on this last week, or some substantial reporting, where they were citing satellite imagery from May, where they say that shows that one of the ships, the Macron, the intelligence ship, that it apparently had a bunch of fast attack boats on its, that it was carrying them, and that maybe that's what they were delivering. However, that those photos were taken before it started on its journey across the Atlantic, so it's possible that they're no longer on that vessel. And Politico also was suggesting that there may be long-range missiles on board, but that was based purely on things that the Trump administration was claiming last summer. They had said that Iran and Venezuela were in talks for a missile sale, but I don't think they ever really cited anything to back that up, whether that ever actually happened. So I don't know how likely that is about the missiles, and I don't really know what these ships are carrying. The Iranians certainly aren't saying, and they're not saying where the ships are going. They have confirmed, though, that they're in the Atlantic. They're not denying that part. That's sort of, they're like touting that as a big success of their Navy, but they have not agreed that they're going to Venezuela. Now, the Associated Press apparently got a hold of a senior aide to Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, and he denied that the ships are going to dock there. And so currently the only people claiming that they're going to Venezuela are anonymous U.S. officials. And they have apparently demanded that the Venezuelans turn the ships away, but Venezuela is saying that they're not even stopping there. So there are some conflicting claims about where they're going. Not that it's extremely unlikely they might be headed to Venezuela. Like, Iran and Venezuela do have a pretty good relationship. They're both under heavy U.S. sanctions. That's kind of pushed them closer together. Iran has been sending fuel tankers over there for deliveries for quite a while. So I'm not 100% ruling out that maybe they're heading to Venezuela. But in terms of who is saying what, it's really only the U.S. right now, I think, that's saying Venezuela. However, as you had said, the Pentagon is like talking about this in very dire terms. They're touting this as like a threat to the entire Western Hemisphere. That's how Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of State, or excuse me, the Secretary of Defense, was speaking about this when he was asked during a Senate hearing last week, that as if they're like transporting a nuclear weapon or something across the Atlantic. That's sort of how he was talking about it. However, if you read Politico's follow-up story, they had one on Wednesday and a follow-up on Thursday. You'll notice a line way at the bottom from an anonymous Pentagon official that I think is pretty revealing. They say that like there are currently no plans to intercept these ships, nor to even watch them more closely, which I think kind of cuts against this idea that they're so concerned about them. Like, not that I want them to monitor them and follow them around or intercept them, but there's kind of a disconnect between saying that this is a threat to the entire left half of planet Earth and the fact that they have no plans of even taking a closer look at them. There's kind of a disconnect there. And people might recall, too, the Trump administration did actually seize 4 Iranian tanker ships headed for Venezuela last summer, or at least they were carrying Iranian fuel. And we covered and criticized that at the time as well. But I don't think Biden intends to do that here. They're not signaling any plans to do that. And that one official explicitly said there are none. And they're also, the last thing I'll say here, I think there would be some legal issues if they were to actually try to intercept those ships. Because unlike commercial shipping vessels, these are what they call sovereign vessels. This is part of Iran's Navy. And so international law says that you can't just go seize someone else's warship because you're saying they're violating your sanctions, which is really all the U.S. is claiming here. So that's basically where the things stand with these ships. They are definitely crossing the Atlantic. That's like, everyone agrees about that. But for what purpose, I don't know. And what they're carrying, I'm not sure. However, the Pentagon hype about all this, I think, is hype. And you can even see the military doesn't even really buy its own hype about this because they're not even planning on, taking a closer look. So I think that says what threat we face from these.
Right. And we have 11 aircraft carriers in our fleet. The hell is the point of an aircraft carrier if we can't, handle the threat of 2 Iranian ships somewhere within 1,000 miles of the United States? I mean, this is absolutely absurd. We spend this much money on our military and we have to be terrified of 2 ships? Come on. So right. What is this really about? And to me, it really says that there's, elements within the government that we know, right, that are less interested in the U.S. returning to their Iran nuclear deal and want to, I think, do everything possible to undermine it. So that would be my take on why we're getting this narrative right now, Will. And I was just wondering if you had any updates on where we are on the nuclear talks. I know this is something like we've almost been updating every show recently because there's so many reports and, we're really hoping that we end up saving this deal, but I think we're on the brink of having it fall apart. And so it's one of the most important things to talk about. And that Tom Cotton, Ted Cruz, Mo Brooks, and the rest of them are going to go to the floor of the House and the Senate, and they're going to sit there and go, Iranian ships are in the Western Hemisphere, now we can't talk to Iran, oh my god, Joe Biden's making it all legitimate, win, win, win.
Exactly.
And so that's what I see happening, but Will, I'll let you chime in.
Sure, yeah. Like, I think it is hard to gauge sort of where this is all going with the nuclear talks, the nuclear deal talks, because I think Biden's people do kind of have some interest in like playing the tough guy and avoiding the perception that they're just going to give away the farm to the Iranians. That was kind of the talking point for the Republicans when Obama was negotiating the JCPOA in the first place. That, oh, he's just giving away everything, he's giving them all this money. But it does kind of, when they want to like sort of avoid that perception, the signals they give, it makes it hard to tell what kind of progress might be happening behind the scenes, you know. And just in the last week, like we did have several things that send these mixed messages. So like I covered a story last Monday where the Secretary of State is saying that, you know, he doesn't even know if there will be an agreement. He says he doesn't know if Iran will ever come back into compliance. He's sounding very pessimistic. He's even warning that Iran's so-called nuclear breakout time, which is like if Iran were to suddenly decide to build a bomb, how long would it take them? And he's warning that it could soon shrink down to a matter of weeks. So like he's like one day they're hawking it up. But then like 3 days later, last week, the Treasury Department actually did lift some sanctions on a few Iranian oil companies. And it sounded like those sanctions actually kind of had some teeth. They weren't just the symbolic ones. And so they did lift those. Yet at the same time, Ned Price, the State Department spokesman, is still insisting it had nothing whatsoever to do with the nuclear talks. He said it's not connected. There's no relation. And so, like, can we call that progress in the negotiations, even if the U.S. is like insisting it isn't and denying that? Like, it's just kind of hard to tell where things are, what kind of progress has been made when they're so fickle in the public statements. So, like, I don't know. I'm not super optimistic about where this stuff is heading, but I am hoping that some of the tough talk from the U.S. side is sort of just like for domestic consumption, and maybe there is more happening behind the scenes than they want to let on. But I don't know. That's just sort of my read of it.
Yeah, at least that's the hope, right? That's kind of where I'm at too, Will, where I really want to believe that's the case, but at the same time, the Biden administration hasn't like really done anything to make me confident in that. As you said, they did lift sanctions. I think the official excuse though wasn't we're doing this as a message or a signal of goodwill to the Iranians. They said they did this because these officials are no longer a part of the government, and so because of that, then we're going to lift the sanctions on their companies as well, which kind of sounds to me like a little bit of maybe a stretch. They are trying to keep the Iran involved, because I don't know why the U.S. government would care to lift the sanctions unless they're doing it to lift sanctions. But so I'm skeptical. And then the other thing I'll mention, Will, just with all of this, I think it's important to remember, as this week we have coming up the Biden-Trump summit, that there tends to be leaks from members of the government, members of the deep state, around the time that the president's going to meet with members of other governments that the U.S. is, that the U.S. has a hostile relationship with, that make it so that the president, it's harder politically to have a positive meeting, right? So if we see leaks this week about, Russia's doing something nefarious, it may be because Biden's about to meet with Putin.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. They do like to throw out these like really dire, scary sounding stories to, especially, I mean, particularly during the Trump administration, like even just the Helsinki meeting and all the stuff that came both before and after that. It really does show sort of where their priorities are. They don't want any kind of détente or rapprochement between particularly us and Russia, for sure.
Right. Well, anything else on Iran? You did throw in there that the State Department warns that Iran's about to get a nuclear weapon, which is absolutely absurd. But I don't know if you want to give any more analysis on it. I know we've talked a lot about how Iran's not close to getting a nuclear weapon, so we don't have to go into that if you don't want to. But I was just wondering if you had anything else on that story.
Yeah, I mean, I could just say that, like Iran, like one thing the Trump administration had did, he sort of made it harder for Iran to get rid of their excess enriched uranium that they're building up right now. And that is the one reason why the Secretary of State is claiming that, their breakout time is getting shorter and shorter because they're building up all this uranium. However, one thing to note is they have not enriched any uranium up to like weapons grade. If they have ever, it's in tiny bench level experiments. They've never done it. Like they're nowhere near actually having a usable nuclear weapon. And so all this talk about their breakout time is often just hype and propaganda.
All right. Well, let's move on and talk about our favorite feds, the FBI, and what antics they have going on with USA Today.
Yeah. I don't have a ton on this one, and the story actually has resolved itself now too. So like, I think this is sort of a done deal. But it's a really crazy story, just in terms of like the government abusing its authority over a media outlet, I think. So this stuff wasn't even known publicly until just a week or two ago, when it was reported on. But back in April, the FBI actually subpoenaed the publisher of USA Today, Gannett, telling them to hand over the data on readers of a specific story that was published in February, like the data from any device that had accessed that particular URL, which is kind of crazy. It's kind of a bizarre request. And they were very vague about why they actually wanted these records. The story in question, the USA Today piece, was about a shooting of 5 FBI agents back in February, 2 of whom were actually killed, and 3 of them were just injured. So it pretty clearly had something to do with that case, which itself was related to a child pornography investigation. The FBI had gone to serve a search warrant, and the suspect had opened fire on them and killed the 2 agents. Before that was all over, though, he killed himself, too, so during that shootout. So it could not have been him that they were interested in. It had to have been some other suspect. But another weird thing about this, too, is that they were just requesting data for just a specific 35-minute time frame right after the story was published. So it was a very strange request in a lot of different ways. And they never really explained it. Like they never explained why they wanted this, how they would use it, why that time frame, who they were looking for. They just sort of demanded this data. Now, Gannett, the publisher, they tried to fight this in court. They tried to have the subpoena tossed, saying that like this would violate privacy rights and First Amendment rights of them and their readers. And they were even arguing that it breached some DOJ regulation, because apparently the FBI is supposed to reach out to a media outlet before just sending them a subpoena out of the blue with no prior contact. And apparently they did not do that with Gannett. They just sent it out of nowhere. However, all this kind of turned out to be unnecessary, though, because last week, the most recent development in this case, the FBI has dropped that subpoena. They just said they were able to identify their suspect by another way. So fortunately, they did not actually compel Gannett to give up these records. But just the fact that the federal government feels that they have this kind of power over the press is kind of alarming, I think. And this was not rejected by a court. Like the FBI withdrew this voluntarily. So there's no like precedent that was set here of a request like this getting rejected. So they could presumably do this as much as they want in the future. I actually didn't even know they could do this, but I guess you learn new things every day about the feds.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think for me and you in particular, Will, this is like fairly concerning, because we're often, looking, especially when there's a breaking story. I do like to read this story from several different sources,
Yeah.
2 or 3 mainstream sources. I don't click on USA Today every time, but I like to go with like a Fox News one, a like, more CNN, MSNBC, one of the newspapers, and, the Wall Street Journal, and see what different people are saying, what they're reporting. And so, this is the kind of thing that me and you would like heavily look into. And how many times it's the FBI coming up with our IP address and stuff like that. And then what does that mean for like me and you as we try to travel through the airport or something like that, especially as they process more and use more and get more of this data. Now, as you said, it's great that USA Today was going to fight it, and it seems like often happens with this, like the FBI almost fishes just to see what they could get away with, and then once they realize they can't get away with it, they say, we made it work out, so we don't actually need this anymore. But it is concerning, especially when you think of the power that federal agents have over you. And, that like if an FBI agent suspects you of something, they come to your house and start talking to you, and they later claim you lied about something, that, you could get charged with a felony to go to jail. It's pretty serious how, conversations with the FBI could go. And, the more Americans they want to look at, the more Americans they're going to throw in jail needlessly and harass their lives. And so, yeah, I was pretty concerned about this. And, again, it was one of those things, too, where I was thinking about it. Like, I put various links, a lot of my news roundup is linking to, like, Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com, but I'm usually not even half of it. There's a lot in there from USA Today, Washington Post, New York Times, Reuters, AP, a lot of different sources. And so now is anybody who's reading the daily news roundup at the Libertarian Institute possibly, getting flagged by the FBI all the time because they're like looking at who's reading these breaking stories. Because we didn't have any indication if this was the first time it happened or how prevalent it is. This is
Right.
just like the first time it's like kind of came to notice. And so let's say, in the past, like the Washington Post was just willing to give the FBI this, have they? And then I also wonder if this tactic has been used on maybe smaller sites with smaller readerships, like maybe a pro-Palestinian site in the U.S. Is only going to have a few thousand readers. And so are they trying to like identify people for potential targets for terrorism investigations based on what sites they're going to? I think these are all possibilities and questions we have to ask.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, absolutely. It kind of reminds me too, like if people might recall, antiwar.com actually had a case with the FBI where I don't recall all the details of it, but there's a lot of really similar kind of bizarre stuff going on where the FBI is snooping around antiwar.com, suggesting that they're up to nefarious things and maybe backed by some foreign power or something. But yeah, the federal agencies, they, best to stay away from the press, I guess.
All right. Well, anything else on the FBI?
No, no, I think that's all we had there. And just I guess speaking of sort of like the abuses of federal agencies, that kind of ties into our next story here. Like we've heard so much about how Donald Trump was this like fascist dictator, how his administration wanted to crush all protests and all dissent against him, including his federal agencies under him, Border Patrol and the DHS, and all this was considered to be uniquely repressive. However, when we see stories like the one we're about to talk about, maybe he wasn't so unique because there was this protest out in Minnesota last week over this pipeline project. I think 1,000 or so climate activists, indigenous protesters showed up. People chained themselves to equipment and stuff. But the way that the federal police agencies tried to disperse these protesters drew some attention. So tell us about what actually happened there.
Right. One of the most famous things I think from the D.C. Black Lives Matter protest last summer, was the helicopter flying right over the heads of protesters, and people were outraged, including me and you, and this is absolutely inappropriate. Now I think that was maybe some military equipment, a National Guard helicopter, but at the same time, this is not ways to treat protesters. And so our point here isn't that Trump isn't a strong-armed authoritarian. Our point is that Biden is too. We have this video here for anybody who wants to watch it. Honestly, this seems almost more dangerous than doing it. I guess maybe there's more chances the helicopter could hit something with buildings around, but this helicopter is kicking up dirt and dust and rots and throwing it in the faces of dozens or scores of protesters that are protesting this pipeline here, and it's disturbing to see this, and it's just common practice. And at least under Trump this kind of behavior drew condemnation, but under Biden it just happens and goes completely unnoticed. This is something that happened last week, and it is a case too that I will point out went out here, so me and Will are throwing together the rest of the recording. I'm pretty sure that's all I had on the helicopter issue, Will. Basically, I was just trying to show the equivalence of the authoritarianism between Biden and Trump, and I think that video is a great demonstration of it, because just not even a year ago, Trump was doing that to Black Lives Matter protesters in D.C. And again, this seems almost more dangerous because the dirt, the dust, the debris, the helicopter could get kicked up. So, Will, I think we have one more story to go through here.
Yeah, we do. So, a few weeks ago, we on the show discussed a series of these bills that have been introduced in the House and the Senate that are aiming to repeal some of the authorizations for the use of military force that are still on the books, or AUMFs. So there are some efforts right now to claw back some of this authority from the executive. However, the White House actually just put out this lengthy report to Congress on the war powers issue last week. I've only had a chance to kind of skim through it, but I know you had some stuff on this. So please tell us about that report and anything else that's going on with war powers.
Yeah, so this is the annual report that the government, I think, is required by law to put out, that informs Congress of the military activities of the White House. And so this it's titled, Letter to the Speaker of the House and President pro tempore of the Senate regarding the war powers. I believe this is the declassified version. I'm not, I'm sure there's a full classified version somewhere. I'm not sure what else is in it. And let me be clear, this is not the extent of the U.S. military operations. This is the extent of the military operations that they made public to us. And so I did think, it was worth it to go through, say what the Biden administration is, what they, will tell the public are their current war powers, what they're currently doing, and then we can maybe talk a little bit about what was left out. But they do say that the U.S. is going to have ongoing counterterrorism operations in Afghanistan. Doesn't exactly what that means. I'm guessing that's special forces operations and then drone strikes and airstrikes against, what they're going to call terrorist groups, which could be, alleged Al Qaeda targets. They could, say this time we're targeting the Haqqani network, this time it's the Taliban, this time it's the Islamic State. So, this could be a very broad war authorization, Will, and a very broad thing. But as far as we know, they're just saying they're carrying out some kind of military operations in Afghanistan. I think they do single out Al Qaeda and the Taliban, but that I don't think doesn't mean like they're not going to carry out strikes against the Islamic State Khorasan group, and they already do that. So I'm sure that's going on. The report claims the U.S. seriously degraded the Islamic State, and I guess in a sense, in Iraq and Syria, that this is true. The Islamic State has been seriously degraded, although, just like in American history books, as always, they leave out the Russian effort involved in that. Right. So, kind of a throwback to World War II there. We pretend, we killed all the Nazis, when really, Russia and the Syrian government were a big part of that. Then we have 2,700 troops in Saudi Arabia, and a large part of those are supporting the Saudi war efforts in Yemen. Right. Then the U.S. has 3,000 troops in Jordan supporting anti-ISIS operations. No clarification on exactly, what those troops are doing, what branch they are, special forces, that they're arming the terrorists or what. 80 troops in Lebanon for counter-terrorism operations. They say that this is training support that the Lebanese government requested. They have there are troops, they don't say how many, outside of Somalia for Al-Shabaab and anti-Islamic State operations in Somalia. We recently had the U.S. AFRICOM commander, General Townsend, say that the U.S. forces are commuting to work in Somalia. So, they're stationed in Kenya or Djibouti and carrying out operations there. Now, separately, the White House points out that we have troops in Kenya and Djibouti for counterterrorism operations in East Africa. So important to note here that these operations just aren't happening in Somalia. They Kenya, Djibouti, Ethiopia, other countries in this region could apparently have these operations as well. And but as far as I know, the only one that airstrikes are occurring in is Somalia, so maybe that's why they named that one separately. They say they're carrying out surveillance missions in the Sahel for counterterrorism operations, and then they say they shared this information with their African and European partners. And well, this sounds like probably the least important thing on the list, and I think the one a lot of people would skip over. But at the same time, if you think about what it could mean to like African dictators to essentially have surveillance from the U.S. or drones, and we provide them with that information, it could be huge in them maintaining their power and controlling their civilians, knowing if rebellions are forming and stuff like this. And so I think this could be far more important information, and not just we're looking at surveillance, and if we see some guy flying the flag of Al Qaeda, we'll tell the government of Burkina Faso. That way they can send their troops to kill those guys. I don't think that's what's happening, or not what's happening all the time, at least. We have 800 troops in Niger for counterterrorism operations. A lot of these troops are deployed at drone bases that operate probably the drones that carry out a lot of the surveillance of the Sahel. I'm not sure if, any of these drones are armed and if we're carrying out airstrikes in any of these countries. They specifically mention Guantanamo Bay and say the U.S. maintains 40 detainees at that facility. We have an undisclosed number of troops in the Philippines for counterterrorism operation, undisclosed number of troops in Turkey for counterterrorism operations, and we have 379 troops in Egypt on an international mission, and they've been in that country since 1981. And then we have 700 troops in Kosovo as a part of the NATO peacekeeping mission, and they've been there since the 90s in the Clinton administration. So, Will, that's what the Biden administration lays out and says our current military operations. We know it's deeper. we know there's a lot more going on. But at the same time, I think it's worth it to put this report forward and to talk about it because, we saw a few years ago when there were the 4 American civilians or soldiers that were killed in Niger. There were senators that were like, "Oh, I didn't know the troops were there." And if you listen to the show, if you go through the War Powers reports, you could find out some of this basic information. Again, don't look at this and say, "Oh, this is a complete checklist of all the places the United States was in fighting wars in." But especially if you're talking to people too, and you're like, "Look at all these countries we're involved in," they might say, "Nah." You could say, "Oh, yes, look at this White House press report. This isn't crazy libertarian talking. This is Joe Biden. Don't you have to take him seriously on all these different wars we're fighting?"
Right. Yeah, well, thank you for breaking that whole thing down. There's a lot of stuff going on there, even if it is not comprehensive itself. Appreciate you doing that. The one point I would want to make is just how ridiculous and flimsy the justifications are. Because I believe you brought up Kenya, and I think we actually just expanded our presence in Kenya recently. And I think they cite the 2001 AUMF, the idea that Al-Shabaab in Somalia is an associated force of Al-Qaeda, and that's what justifies keeping American soldiers in Kenya in Africa. So just like the crazy, flimsy, multi-layered justifications for how they get there I find it ridiculous. But I guess fortunately there are some efforts right now to try to restrain that, I guess. But that's about my thoughts there.
All right. Well, I think we've had enough tech issues for the show, Will. The power just came back on and it dropped my standing desk down like a foot. So just a little bit more of the fun if anybody heard some noise there. But we will be wrapping. I think we covered a lot of great stuff today, Will. Remember, people share the show, YouTube or Odyssey for the video versions. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. You get your CBD products at palomaverdecbd.com and use the promo code PEACE when you check out. You follow the show on Facebook, MeWe, or Twitter. The Twitter handle is at @con_interest. Will Porter is at the Will Porter on Twitter, and I'm at Kyle Ansloan_. Thanks, Will.
Thanks, Kyle. Bye, everybody.